Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here with us today because we're unpacking a genuinely fascinating theological document. I mean, if you've ever wondered how ancient institutions manage to preserve their oldest, most sacred traditions while, at the same time, holding together a massive global structure, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're exploring a core theological argument presented in our source text about what it actually means to preserve religious traditions. It's a super delicate balance between the past and the present, and the framework we're looking at today addresses exactly how that balance is maintained. Okay, let's dive into this by asking the big, overarching question right out of the gate. Can religious tradition survive without institutional authority? It's a tension you'll find in almost any large, enduring organization, but it is especially pronounced in a global religion. On one hand, you have these ancient practices, timeless rituals, and a really deep desire to preserve the way things have just always been done. But on the other hand, you have a living, breathing institution that absolutely requires structure, leadership, and present-day authority to hold millions of people together. Our source text tackles this tension head-on, impartially outlining a very specific theological rule for maintaining unity. Let's look at the first major theme the text introduces to resolve all of this. Section 1. Tradition and Church Unity. According to the document we're analyzing, the concepts of tradition and unity are completely, inextricably linked. The text lays out the premise that the successor of St. Peter, meaning the Pope, acts as the Church's visible principle of unity. So why does this matter to you as we unpack this framework? Well, because the entire argument essentially hinges on this one idea. The source insists that you literally cannot have authentic fidelity to sacred tradition if you separate it from fidelity to this visible principle of unity. They are a package deal. You can't just embrace the history while ignoring the present-day leadership structure that was built to carry that history forward. And to back this up, the text points us to a highly specific, authoritative historical document. Section 2. John Paul II's 1988 letter. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it anchors the broader theological argument in a very specific moment in time. The text draws directly from the apostolic letter Ecclesia Dei, written by Pope St. John Paul II back in 1988. This document directly addresses the rules of communion and tradition. So by citing this letter, our source is telling us that this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate, right? It's a formalized rule within the Church's modern history. Let's look exactly at what John Paul II wrote because the language used here is remarkably strong and honestly leaves very little room for ambiguity. I actually want to slow down for a second and read this exact quote because the wording is incredibly deliberate. It is impossible to remain faithful to the tradition while breaking the ecclesial bond with him to whom, in the person of the Apostle Peter, Christ himself entrusted the ministry of unity in his church. Notice the use of the word impossible. The text doesn't say it's difficult or, unadvisable. It says it literally cannot be done. The core takeaway here is this concept of the ecclesial bond. The argument is that Christ entrusted the ministry of unity to Peter and his successors. Therefore, breaking that bond in the name of tradition, well, it actually breaks the tradition itself. Let's move to and see how this builds into the document's direct critique of a specific mindset. The text explicitly dispels what it calls a false notion. And that false notion is the idea that an individual or group can preserve Catholic tradition while simultaneously rejecting or separating themselves from the authority established by Christ. The document argues that this is essentially an oxymoron. You cannot champion the tradition of the institution while rejecting the institutional authority that the tradition itself points to. To really drive this concept home, the source uses a fantastic visual metaphor that I think perfectly clarifies the theology. Section 3. Museum versus living inheritance. And this brilliantly illustrates the heart of the document's message. On one hand, we have the idea of a museum piece, something dusty, frozen in time, locked behind glass, and preserved totally apart from the living church. The text completely rejects this view of tradition. Instead, it points us to tradition as a living inheritance. But what keeps it alive? The source argues it's kept alive because it is actively safeguarded by the magisterium, the teaching authority of the Church, in communion with the Roman pontiff. It breathes, it functions, and it has life, precisely because it is connected to the living authority of the Church, not just isolated in a display case. Section 4. The Traditional Latin Mass. The source document then takes the principles we've just discussed and applies them neutrally and directly to those who hold a deep love for the traditional Latin Mass, or the ancient Roman Rite. The text outlines that the treasures of the Church's liturgical tradition actually flourish most authentically through structured authority, rather than through separation from it. It's really a call to those who value ancient liturgical practices to realize that the survival and the flourishing of those practices totally depend on staying integrated with the broader church hierarchy. So how does one actually do that in practice? Well, the text gives us 3 specific requirements. So the crucial point is that preserving ancient tradition isn't just about repeating old rituals, right? It requires specific, actionable virtues. The document explicitly demands 3 of them. First up, filial obedience. Think of it like the respectful obedience a child has for a parent. Second, ecclesial charity, which is maintaining a spirit of love and unity within the broader church community. And third, unwavering communion with the Holy Father and our bishops. This is the practical roadmap the source provides. You want to preserve the ancient Roman rite? The text argues you must do so by cultivating these exact 3 virtues, remain deeply tethered to the current leadership. And this whole concept is beautifully summarized by the document in one final unifying Latin phrase. Section 5. Sub Umbra Petri. The source text caps off its entire argument with this phrase, defining sub Umbra Petri as Latin for under the shadow and protection of Peter. It is such a powerful, evocative image, isn't it? It perfectly encapsulates everything we've covered in this explainer. The text is making the ultimate case that the Church's greatest liturgical treasures and most ancient traditions do not need to be hidden away or defended against the institution. Rather, they are meant to reside securely under the protection of the Pope. It's an argument that true tradition is inherently safe when it rests in communion with the very authority established to guide it. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder on our last slide. How do modern institutions balance the preservation of ancient traditions with obedience to present authority? We've seen exactly how our source text answers this for its specific context, by insisting that tradition and authority are simply inseparable. But it's a delicate, deeply fascinating balance that echoes across so many areas of human organization. I really hope this explainer has brought this complex theological framework into clear focus for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. Keep asking those great questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.